So what I would like to do is start with I have to put on my glasses to see the clock. So the motivating questions, and then tell you kind of how they were worked out in the course of the project. So as you know, I work on African countries, and we have this kind of paradox or puzzle in African studies, which is the following. So actually, socioeconomic inequalities or economic inequalities are very severe in African countries, as I'll illustrate in a minute. But the work on African politics tells us that these don't really influence politics. So this, in many ways, runs against everything that we expect about inequalities, including all the reasons that motivate us to study inequality, their salience in politics, besides, sort of the welfare and other social implications. So this was a puzzle, that these inequalities do not matter in African studies. And actually, political scientists who work on Africa have made that argument explicitly. And they've argued sort of against the economic cleavage perspective in favor of others. And so as this slide indicates, these are some of the main sort of strategy lines of analysis about cleavage in African countries. And many come in the form of arguments that are made as a direct critique of arguments that would hint at or hypothesize that economic cleavages would be predominant. So we have this authoritarian politics model, elite versus mass. This has intuitive resonance or kind of ripples throughout much of the analysis. There's exploitative, greedy, opportunistic elite that is the source of many ills and is the source of the pernicious political mobilization strategies that then emanate out and mobilize populations in ways that reflect cleavages other than economic inequalities. There is, of course, the ethnic politics model, sort of the default go-to model for understanding cleavage and political division in African countries. And I'll talk more about that, but this is kind of virtually default hegemonic status in the literature. And then there is a kind of enduring transition, this third sort of enduring kind of model that is a kind of elite versus mass model, but has a spatial component, the urban versus rural. So the idea popularized by Jeff Herbst in States and Markets in Africa, that there's a spatial core governed by a tight elite, but that the peripheries or the rural areas, as it were, basically ungoverned. So this is an idea of social cleavage or political cleavage that is not very well operationalized in the politics literature, but indeed cuts against the idea that there would be societal socioeconomic cleavages that structure politics. So this is the prevailing work. And what I did in this project is to make a very different argument, or an argument that is quite different, although overlaps in some ways, as you'll see. So the argument of this project is that in African countries, the kind of inequality that structures politics is spatial or regional inequality. So the social cleavages we really need to track and look at and try to understand if we want to understand political dynamics are the regional ones, the spatial regional inequalities that structure politics, the regional inequalities that give rise to regionalism. And as I'll unpack as we go forward, the argument in this project is that this regionalism arises from uneven development, sort of classic understood, basically classic forms of uneven development, but in this case, kind of uneven development that is produced and reproduced by the way African economies are integrated into the world economy from the colonial era going forward. So this kind of processes of uneven development overlaid by territorial structures of government that were laid down during the colonial period structure the regionalism that we observe. That's the basic argument. And then I try over the course of the text to make a series of interrelated arguments about why this prevails. So if we observe if the claim is regionalism structures politics, then how do we supposedly see regionalism in politics? So here I tried to kind of cut into a number of conversations in African politics and African political economy about the way issue cleavages do or do not structure politics, or the way issues do or do not structure electoral coalitions. So as you see on this slide, skipping down to here, so that this kind of regionalism helps to explain the kinds of cleavages and coalitions that do and do not form in national politics. It gives insight into why there's tension, or insight into the fact that there is tension over growth models within African countries, and where the sources of those tensions, where they emerge, help to explain coalition building in national politics. I think I have time to touch on that here. Has some implications for how we understand ethnicity and electoral clientelism. So ethnicity doesn't totally drop out, and I'll try to show you over the course of the talk sort of how it comes back in ways that are the same, and in many ways that are different from the way ethnicity comes into other political explanations, and underscores the territorial salience of state structure, the salience of territorial state structure. So this is an institutionalist dimension of the argument that turns out to be very important in getting to the outcome to be explained. But then this top point here under this heading is that one of the things that this perspective does is it kind of brings us back in political science studies of African politics to a more longue durée perspective. So we've had a lot of micro work and a lot of work on behavioral and experimental work in the last, 2 decades. So this kind of gives us back a chance to contemplate a long durée story of change and constancy over time, and also a particular way of comparing politics cross-nationally, across the African continent. So I think, we get some hypotheses about politics that we need in order to sort of build better other theories and do more research, sometimes around the micro models or even the ethnicity models, but presumably in a different way. So that's kind of the overarching contribution. This is the outline of the talk. So first, I just want to touch on this point of inequality, economic inequality within African countries. Then sort of lay out a little better the argument about how spatial inequalities or geographic inequalities are overlaid by territorial institutions. This is not unique to African countries, but this is an argument that I can develop in the African cases. Third, just try to link this discussion of regionalism within Africa to the classic works in political sociology on national political integration. And here's a part of the project that I like, because one of the things I tried to do was to leverage a lot of comparative political economy theory, including state formation and national economic integration in Europe, and try to say that what we see in Africa actually really shouldn't be surprising at all to us as comparativists, given what we know or what we observed in other cases, other similar cases, without, of course, suggesting that African countries are going to, follow the same trajectories of other cases. But what we observe now is often isomorphic to what we have observed in other cases. And then part 4 is to turn to the evidence. So I'll just kind of tell you descriptively at a high level what we did and what we found, and under these 3 headings, and then conclude. So I think my talk should end at 12:20, 12:30. Great. Okay. So inequality in African countries. So this is just some data. I didn't do this. This is from some other published sources, and actually IMF sources, but this is about income inequality in African countries. So these figures depict interpersonal income inequality. So on the left, these are, let's see if I can get the pointer. Yeah, these are world regions. This is 1980 through 2010, and the different lines are different world regions. So this this black line is the says advanced economies. So this is the Gini here, sort of gradually increasing over time as expected. This blue line is Europe and Central Asia. So I'm not quite sure why they clustered those two, but this basically conforms to our general expectations, low and increasing. The dark blue here is Latin America, so that's not surprising either. We usually think Latin America is the most unequal region in the world by the Gini, but this red line here, these are the African countries. So by this particular rendering, the African countries, over time, consistently very high interpersonal income inequality by this measure. And this is the same data here, but sort of depicted differently. The dots are countries. So this huge red cloud here is the African countries. That's the Gini. And this is the log of real GDP per capita. So the green, rest of the world, the ASEAN nations are here in blue. They're just as comparatives, but what we're looking at is these red ones. So this also kind of fits with what we know. This is probably South Africa right here. This South Africa is somewhere in here, wealthy country, one of the highest Ginis in the world. And Namibia and some of the other Southern African countries are surely up here. But, as you can see, for their GDP per capita, their African countries very high interpersonal income inequality. So this is the first thing we noticed. Actually, this kind of data was very surprising in comparative, because for a long time, Africa was kind of conventionally thought of as a low income inequality, as a continent or sub-region of low income inequality countries. People say, oh, they're poor countries, everybody's poor, minuscule, super rich elite, but basically low income inequality. People attribute it to the landholding structure, basically, no large landed aristocracy in contrast, or landed elite in contrast to the high income inequality Latin American countries. So this is interpersonal. So what we did in this project is go, whoa, this is spatial inequality. So this is inequality across provinces or admin one regions. And in this slide, these blue dots are African countries. So here, the blue dots are African countries and the orange ones are comparisons to other parts of the world. So that's Brazil, for example. So here's the Gini that we saw before. So high, these are the high inequality countries. And this is regional inequality measure based on nightlight luminosity at admin one. So Christian Lesmond is at LMU. So this was his data. But what we're seeing here, what I would like to underscore is this huge blue cloud of high spatial inequality African countries. So that's Brazil. And I picked these countries, some other high regional inequality countries. The UK, by many measures, a lot of people say the UK is the most spatially unequal country in Europe. So the UK is here. Spain, which is the subject of a lot of the recent literature on the politics of spatial or geographic income inequality in Europe. Spain is the exemplar of high regional inequality. It's here. The US is somewhere around here. It didn't come out on this slide. US and China are both somewhere around here. But the point is that in African countries, we have two kinds of inequality that are very high. So we have interpersonal income inequality and we have this geographic inequality. So two super high forms of income inequality. So what I tried to argue in the text is that people who said socioeconomic cleavages don't matter were looking for some sort of proxy or something like class-like cleavages or cleavages based on income. My argument is to sort of turn this around and say, well, whatever you want to say about the class, what is really salient in politics is these spatial or geographic cleavages. And I build up that argument by leaning on this CPE argument that advanced by, you may know, Beramendi and Rogers. Pablo Beramendi is working with Melissa Rogers, and Melissa Rogers has a book called Politics of Place, where she argues that, something that is kind of obvious, but she spins out the argument that is intuitively plausible, that the form of income inequality that will be most salient in politics will be determined by the structure of political representation. So if you have strongly territorial representation, we will expect that geographic cleavages will be highly salient in politics. And actually in her book uses as case studies the US, Germany, and Argentina. So I modeled this figure actually after a lot of the figures that she produced, but I folded in the African countries. So I make that argument here that what we see in African countries in a kind of extreme form is territorial institutions overlaying regional inequalities, just overlaying right on top. So right along the lines of the spatial or territorial inequalities, we have the regional grid of representation and of the regional grid that structures state intervention across space. And so for my 12 countries in my study, which I'll introduce to you in a second, I made this 2x2. Sort of on the vertical, put this territorial institutions. So we have countries, hypothetically, worldwide with strongly territorial institutions. The argument here is these strongly territorial ones promote regionalization of politics. And then the opposite, as it were, is the centralizing or nationalizing institutions that would dilute territorial interests. So actually, if we had a world sample, we could, we would slot different countries across the world into these different cells. So what this slide actually does is to put my 12 African, or sort of think about this with respect to the African cases. So the argument that I make in this book is that almost, African countries, most African countries fall into cell 1. So they have high spatial inequality and strongly territorial institutions. So we would, Melissa Rogers would say the US is here as well, as is, Germany, and for her, Argentina. I tried to kind of stretch it out a little bit in my cases to get some variation across the 12 African cases that I looked at. And I do argue that, here we have Tanzania as a little bit anomalous. It's more stronger, centralized, internationalizing institutions. So we should see some expected effects in Tanzania to be somewhat different. And I also included South Africa in the 12 country sample because it is, if you want, in terms of a 2x2, sort of the opposite of what we mostly expect in the other African countries. So this is basically the argument, and it was just taken straight out of this Melissa Rogers Politics of Place and the other work that Melissa Rogers has done with Pablo Beramendi on the politics of geographic or spatial inequality. I forgot to say, please do, feel free to interject at any moment. So far this, at any moment. So I have this kind of basic 2x2 sort of theoretical line of approach. But to kind of backfill and to develop this theory of regionalism, I tried to rely on this Lipset and Roken and Karamani and others about the nationalization or non-nationalization of politics. And, Lipset and Roken actually does a lot of work just laying the theoretical groundwork. And part of the reason I like to use this is because it is familiar to a lot of comparativists and people who do political sociology, and they worked on territorial politics in the course of national economic integration and have a lot of straightforward claims that, seem to actually be quite suggestive in the African cases. So, Lipset and Roken, processes of national economic integration or building the national economy can accentuate and politicize regional economies, and that accentuate and politicize regional inequalities. That's basically the argument that I make. So following Lipset and Roken, we should expect to see, of course, core periphery cleavages, but we should also expect to see differentiation across rural regions. We should expect to see urban-rural. And according to these kind of theories from this European state-building national integration literature, we should also expect by default, or sort of intuitively plausible, that the leading regions, the core economic regions, will also be the politically leading regions, that you would, as a default hypothesis, expect the economic and political core to align, especially, over time, that they would come into alignment. This is not always true, of course, but hypothesis. And then here, this is the Beramendi and Rogers argument, Christian Bucket, others, about the alignment of territorial institutions and spatial inequalities. And then also, I tried to extract the predicted effects, or how we would expect to see this kind of politics of national economic integration playing out in national level politics. So numerous implications for the substance of national politics. So Pablo Beramendi has made much of his work is about how territorial inequalities depress demand for redistribution. So leading, some of the obvious leading regions don't want to redistribute, et cetera. There should be, according to this literature, sort of resistance or higher cost or more difficult processes of centralization of national institutions, especially including fiscal institutions, or trails on the other. We should expect to see with large, not only regional inequalities, but differentiation, sectoral differentiation across regions, more volatility in national politics when you get turnover at the center. And, as many scholars have argued, this kind of competition, territorial competition across provincial level units or subnational units, tends to crowd out programmatic policymaking at the national level and to favor pork barrel and other kinds of piecemeal spending that sort of cements deals across regions and, preempts or crowds out the possibility of truly national programmatic policy. So it's interesting, as I'll maybe have time to mention later, these are effects that are indeed observed in African countries, often attributed to ethnic politics per se. So what I try to do here is to say, hey, this is all here in this regionalism literature. So this kind of alternative theory about what is happening here. So here, these effects are strongly visible in African countries. So that's the argument I try to spin out. Canonical forms of uneven development and, tensions expressed in these issue areas. So there's one part of the book that tries to go through these issue areas and to make the case that we see this in African countries, but I don't think I'll be able to talk about that today. So the evidence for the argument is twofold, two kinds of evidence. First, there's a kind of history, economic, geography kind of evidence I will talk about first, and then secondly, which I'll get to, it's an electoral geography-based argument. So on the history and economic geography, the first part is about the origins of regions and regional differentiation. So this is actually, everybody knows that, under colonial rule, Africa, the colonies that were demarcated that, as become African countries, are incorporated into the world economy on this highly geographically uneven basis as the colonial powers foster and provoke or elicit the development of export-producing regions. So they're not exactly enclaves in the sense that enclaves are small, but they're geographically, regionally compact export-producing regions. So we have this differential incorporation of the subnational regions into the world economy. So we have a cocoa-producing region, a coffee-producing region, a tea region, et cetera. There are some other variants. There are mining regions, there are labor-sending regions, but it's kind of strong regional economic differentiation. So I think people kind of know that, and the main additional argument that's layered on here is that the territorial state institutions overlay this uneven development of the colonial/national economy. So if economic geography comes first, state territorial grid comes a second, as the colonizing powers delimit the regions around these, delimit the regional grid around the productive spaces. So they outline a cocoa region and containerize that within the regional grid. So I'll argue that these institutions persist over time. The territorial grid of the state persists over time, and the economic geography largely persists too. So here on the economic geography, this resonates intuitively with the argument that people make that tells us that there's been limited or very disappointing degree of structural transformation of African countries over time, and that most just still rely on these basic primary commodity exporting sectors as the foundation of the national economy. So on the institutional side, I think one of the main findings of the project was this argument that the institutional grid has not changed much over time. And so with one of my co-PIs was Lee Gardner in economic history at the LSE, and she worked with her PhD student, Jennifer Kohler, to these boundary analyses where we overlaid, this is the native authority boundary. So those are these kind of so-called, what the British called the tribal units, the native authority boundaries nested within districts. And so we took the old ones for Ghana and Nigeria, and we overlaid the new district boundaries onto the same map to just show the surprising, degree of isomorphism past and present. So this kind of goes to the idea of the persistence of the territorial grid. And I have one other slide that I want to show you. That's also super interesting for political scientists. We also, this is Ghana, we overlaid the electoral constituencies on the historic boundaries. And these two maps basically tell you that the native authorities, or these so-called, what the British called the tribal jurisdictions, also, very strongly correspond to the electoral constituencies. So the native authority units and the admin 2, and here on the right, we have electoral constituencies and the admin 2. So these basic maps are largely preserved. So this is a persistence of a territorial, administrative, representative grid of state institutions that overlays the a provincial map of export producing regions. And I'll talk to you in a second about the export producing regions. So when decolonizing time comes after World War II, the political parties that first emerge are political parties that emerge off of the district level units in the export crop producing regions. So the wealthiest export producing regions are the political leaders and form these political parties that I will argue over the course of the analysis sort of persist as politically leading regions over time. So the political and party systems that emerge in this era of decolonization largely persist within these economically leading export producing regions. So this is how we get this kind of overlay of territorial grid, politically mobilized regions, and wealthier regions that produces this effect of the politicization around these patterns of uneven development and spatial inequality. So here's the economic geography part, which I did with the postdoc that we have the last 2.5 years of the project, Juliette Crespin-Boucaud. There's her photo. And here is where she's at Namur now. So we have the 12 African countries. So the question is, how do you observe regionalism in politics? So we took 12 countries that have had national elections since 1990. And, the hypothesis is if there's regionalism in politics, you should see that in electoral competition. And indeed, what we did was take all the elections. This is the electoral geography. So we took the available elections since 1990. So for some of the countries, that's 6 or 7 elections. And for a couple in the data set, it's just 3, the data of varying quality. And we did a cluster analysis on constituency level electoral returns. So for each election, we see clusters of constituencies that are basically voting together at very high vote shares, like 70% of the votes the threshold is 70% of the votes in the constituency. And so what we want is clusters of constituencies, all of which are voting at 70% or higher for the same candidate. So you take those maps, let's say you have 6 elections over time, and you layer them onto each other, and you identify the constituencies that tend to be in these same cores in each election, or in most of the elections. So this is how we get this thing we call persistent electoral blocks. And those are regional blocks. So once we get the regional blocks, we can make them into a polygon and sort of derive or come up with, using the luminosity data, a GDP proxy, or level of economic development, regional income proxy for each of the clusters. So that's how we can see if the clusters are more, wealthier, or, compare them to each other and to the parts of the country that are not clustering. So this is how we describe the inequalities across a space block. The main way we do with the luminosity, the DHS data we can use to, we do use to track the variation in levels of educational achievement. So richer regions are advantaged in level of secondary school completion. To deal with the ethnicity part, DHS also has a self-reported ethnicity, so we can see if the electoral clusters are mono-ethnic or not. Then we use the colonial maps to overlay the blocks onto colonial era producer regions and satellite data that describes the crop characteristics using the satellite data to get the production characteristics or agricultural production characteristics of the regions today. So we can compare past and present, and we also overlay the administrative units to see if these are the same as the colonial era admin ones or the native authorities, et cetera. So this is how we layer in these different kinds of data to sort of provide support for the argument. So here we have 8 of the 12 countries, and I just put this up kind of to illustrate, maybe talk about, I'll talk about Côte d'Ivoire, since I'm going there on Sunday. So this is Côte d'Ivoire. So what you see here is 3 blocks. So the intensity of the color doesn't really mean anything. We didn't really, yes, they're just 3 colors of blue. But we have these, this dark blue one, though, as it is a long dominant block, but this is another. Anyway, there are 3 blocks, and what this shows is these are regions that constituencies that consistently vote together over time in almost all of the elections they've had since 1990. So we define these as blocks, and then we extract attributes, or we generate descriptive attributes of the blocks based on the kind of data that I already described. So we do that for the 12 countries. And Kenya is here. So vast literature in English on African politics and party competition about Kenya. So the blocks actually look very intuitive to the people who know these countries. What most people who know these countries, though, would intuitively gravitate toward the argument that they're ethnic blocks. So we did analyze the ethnic composition of the blocks, and we find out they're pretty, almost all of them are very heterogeneous ethnically. The only mono ethnic block we have in the entire data set is this one in Kenya, but the others are quite heterogeneous. So these are some of the findings that we get from across the, these are sort of descriptive stats. So there are 36 electoral blocks in the data set. Most of them are economically advantaged over the non-block areas. And so we can conclude that these clusters are forming in wealthier areas of each country. Most of them overlap with the colonial era export regions, and so it kind of map onto this historical argument that we laid out at the onset, and most of them retain this economic specialization into the current period. This was very interesting. The block rankings with respect to each other remain very stable for most of the countries. So the block that was the wealthiest in 1990. So 1990 comes sort of at a moment at the end of the so-called lost decades. There was very little growth in African countries from around 1974 to 1990. So this 1990 observation this sort of gives us insight into the earlier period as well. But what we see, the basic finding here is there's very little change in block rankings. The one that was the richest first is the richest at the end of the period. Most of them do indeed overlap or coalesce within the admin one, the provincial level units, colonial era provincial level units. So that's when the era of party political mobilization first occurred. And then most are multi-ethnic. And I have a slide in the reserve slide that I can show you that has to do with the multi-ethnicity of the blocks. But I think in about half of the 36 blocks, the largest ethnic group is a majority. But the majorities, many of the majorities around 50% or 55%. So they don't really rise up to that level of the 70% of the 70% wins of the candidates in those constituencies. But we don't try to go too far on that argument. The basic argument is that most of them are quite multi-ethnic. So this is one of the ways we use the data to illustrate this point about economic inequality within the block. So this is Kenya, and this is these 4 blocks, and plus the capital city, sort of depicted in these measures of economic advantage. So here's the average pixel luminosity ranking, and here's the percentage of adults having completed secondary education. So this is the central block. So this is the block that corresponds right here to the dark blue. So that's convenient in terms of the color coding. But this is the one that has dominated politics for 70% of the time, approximately, since independence. 75% of the elections. So we make this argument that their main rival in national politics for most of this time has been this Western bloc over here. And, this is very persistent axis of territorial competition over many decades, pitting these two against each other. And so very obvious economic disparity, especially here, it shows up here in terms of percentage of adults having completed secondary education. But the part of the country that is not shaded, so the non-block parts, much poorer overall than the block regions. And Kenya is interesting because some of these other two are swings, especially this one is sort of a swing block. So we try to make an argument about how the polls sort of pull the Rift Valley block in and out of politics over time. But the main argument here, sort of pulling off of Lipset and Roken, is that there's a dominant axis of territorial competition in Kenyan politics that pits this blue dot central block against the Western one, and that is a very consistent theme in national level political competition. So in terms of the national patterns, we get these results. So the economically dominant blocks are usually in power in most of the country. So this intuition that the richer ones lead and dominate in politics is confirmed in this way. We find that the way they win, the coalitional pattern is usually the winning bloc forms electoral coalitions with the unshaded ones. So you rarely get electoral blocks aligning stably with each other over time. So these arguments about clientelism in presidential elections, they don't really drop out of the analysis, but the argument I try to make here is that this kind of, one-off clientelism sort of applies best to the relationship between the leading parties and these non-block constituencies that they can kind of pick up opportunistically. But the blocks actually, the argument that we make, are secured around the sectoral interests of the regions, based on this idea of a sectoral specialization across the regions. The opposition parties usually form in the economically favored regions, so that also would be as expected. So the opposition parties form in these kind of secondary economic clusters that are, in most countries, it usually, largely out of power for most of the time. And then, as I've already mentioned, the issues that divide national electorates, once you have the elections and the blocks, you can sort of read back in, if you want, or see how these issues of redistribution, of sectoral policy, of course, that would be most commonly policy targeted toward particular producer regions, like coffee, producer subsidies for coffee, something like that, very highly used to mobilize electorates in these producer regions. The national market integration argument here is developed around land policy. So we see that the strongest leading economic regions are usually the ones that have the most commodified land, but also most enthusiastically support policies aimed at sort of more generally bringing land into national markets through registration and titling nationwide. And then it is these lagging regions, as predicted, that resist the commodification because they will be losers, since they will be losers. Their experiences, they structurally lose, but they lose out in access to finance and access to the state that makes that possible. And then, of course, we can tap into huge literature on state design of centralization, federalism, decentralization, and show that we see the predicted effects of the strongest regions heavily pro-centralization, and the lagging regions always pushing for regional autonomy. Lagging regions or rich regions out of power pushing for regional autonomy and more decentralization. So conclusion. So this slide is basically a summary. So the uneven economic development giving rise to these regional cleavages in politics. Again, this is a phenomenon that not unique to African countries. So we've had occasion this week to see how this plays out in the United States. The argument being that these arguments hold for many African countries. I always have to say many because in our sample there were only 12. But one of the main arguments is that this is politics as usual. So electoral politics and national policy competition can be understood largely in these terms. So it's true that, of course, there's a large literature on conflict that is very much would conform to these findings. Here, we transpose that, do two things to that argument. First, say that indeed this is politics as usual. And, that's intuitively plausible also because many of the countries that have a secessionism and these overt conflict around national distribution of power, secessionism, are ones that also, go back to politics as usual in the non-secessionist periods. And so we see the same kind of regional politics animating electoral as well as the conflict politics. So what we can do here is sort of raise questions or sort of ask people to take another look at these ethnic arguments, and also reinforce the importance of the territorial grid itself, since the grid structures the delivery, as it were, the supply of government in the regions, as well as the structures of political representation. And so finally, just with respect to the economics of nation building, I think, it's an argument that links these kinds of regional politics to some of the difficulties of development, if you want, or difficulties of sort of fashioning growth models that promote national economic integration. Because here, as predicted, and as we know from other countries around the world that have strong geographic tensions, sort of a national level growth model is likely to, or primed to, sort of incite or provoke tensions between leading and lagging regions. And we see this very systematically in African countries. So the lagging regions will always fear this kind of adverse incorporation. The leading regions are often seen as sort of exerting a kind of economic imperialism, or an internal colonialism, if you will, over the lagging regions. So this kind of tension around growth policy, accentuated or brought to the fore by the structure of representation, is a persistent feature. So shaping the content, but also the sustainability of growth policy. So when you have power shifting back and forth, and we see this also in many anecdotes within the 12 cases, shifting from party A to party B, or block A to block B. So many of them, there's kind of these persistent competition between the two wealthy, the first and second regions, the region in first economic place and second economic place. So when the power shifts, when there is alternance in office of policies a shift. So you do also have this problem of policy sustainability that has been observed in other countries. And then finally, at the level of policy, I think this is something that also is very intuitive for people in the EU, and not so much maybe in African countries or in the US, but underscoring the strong need, if you're interested in national cohesion and sustainability of policy, for closer integration of this kind of territorial policy, the sectoral policy, and the welfare policy, since the territorial divisions are so highly politically salient for the reasons that, some of which have been mentioned here. So on that note, I will stop, and thank you for listening, and I'll be interested to hear your ideas about this. So thank you.